Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can follow through email updates and also the RSS feed. I'm on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, a whole host of other podcatchers. There's always new ones out there, so let me know if you find any new ones as well. You can, of course, go to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, where everything is archived. I'm also replayed on Friday nights on a host of other networks, including PSN, People's Internet Radio, Ed Opperman's Spreaker channel, and hopefully soon we'll be on Ocelli.com, although I think Chuck is playing some of our shows, but I've got to finalize and sort of nail down a specific time, but we'll also be on Ocelli.com. You can still hear me, I believe, on KYAH 540 AM out in Utah from 6 to 8 Mountain Time on Saturday nights, although I don't believe we'll be continuing with that. The upside of which is that we can go back to cursing on the show, which we weren't able to do on an AM station, but we will be able to do so now. But enough of me babbling on. Very excited about my guest for today. We are welcoming back Associate Professor Isa Blumi of the Stockholm University. He is a professor at the Department of Asian, Middle Eastern, and Turkish Studies. And of course, we had Isa on the show about 2 weeks ago now on episode 148, where we discussed the geopolitical and economic history of Yemen, its role as a very progressive, independent nation. We talked about North Yemen, South Yemen, when we sort of covered the period between the 1800s up until about the mid to late 2000s. And we're going to be kind of picking up that conversation again today because there is, of course, so much to discuss. I also want to just mention that you can get Isa's book, which we'll link up to in the show notes. His new book, which is Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. But Isa Blumi, how are you? It's good to be talking to you again and have you back on the show.
I'm very grateful for having the chance to once again speak to you and to your audience.
Excellent. Well, like I said, we covered quite a lot of ground last time you were on the show. But again, I mean, 2 hours, even a 2-hour show like this with almost no commercial breaks, we barely kind of scratched the surface, and we got up to, I guess, sort of modern Yemen history. But there's still a lot more to unpack with all of this. And like I said, I think last time we got up to about 2011, although, because of time constraints, we sort of rushed through the 90s with the unification of Yemen and then the civil war that broke out in 1994 within Yemen. And we moved kind of, at a brisk pace up to about 2011, which is when the large-scale protests in Yemen began, which would eventually lead to Ali Abdullah Saleh being ousted from the country. And I wanted to continue that, but Isa, I thought we could kind of jump back a little bit to the late 1990s and tell the listeners a little bit more about Saleh, because he's a figure that I think we're going to be talking about a lot today. And again, just like Yemen, which has this whole hidden history, which you talk about in your book, Destroying Yemen, and in our conversation, I think Saleh is vastly misunderstood in the Western media and in the narrative there. While I don't necessarily like Ali Abdullah Saleh, he is a fascinating figure and someone that was quite savvy politically, albeit in a very brutal way at times. But let's talk a little bit about the strategy that Saleh used in the mid to late 1990s when he was solidifying power, and talk about how he played. He was constantly playing various political and social groups off one another. We have, he fought against the Houthis back in the 90s, and then, as we'll talk about later, he joined up with the Houthis. We also have the introduction of Al-Qaeda, which plays a very significant role still to this day in Yemen. And maybe we can kind of, there's a very famous quote from Ali Abdullah Saleh that I think many people will be somewhat familiar with, but he said that something to the effect that like governing Yemen was like dancing on the head of a snake. So Isa, if you can, talk to us and explain a bit to the listeners what Yemen looked like in the mid to late 90s when Saleh came in, and what he ultimately did to construct this new Yemen that would be a unified Yemen under his control for many, many years.
Yes. Well, first of all, it's a good way to put everything in its present day catastrophe of Yemen. To go back, of course, and that's the larger argument I've long made, that one has to look backwards and understand roots, if you will, and a series of continuations, and how indeed certain kinds of contingencies were actually formed for us to appreciate the visceral violence that not only rhetorical, but as it is, we see now manifested also with use of very deadly weapons. And certainly Saleh's one of the most notorious quotes, and it's a title, in fact, of a book written by a journalist that, for probably the wrong reason, still remains the go-to book to understand Yemen. And I must correct you, he was actually referring to the plural. It's not one snake, it's the multiplicity of snakes.
Oh.
Governing Yemen is like dancing on the heads of various size snakes as well. And I would also suggest that there are often different kinds of creatures that come on in this large zoo of what we would call the larger Arabian Peninsula, and indeed the global political scene. And it's important to highlight that something is happening with the world from the late 1980s onwards. And Yemen, long resilient, long resistant to the pressures coming from the capitalist world, let's say. Clearly, South Yemen had found safe haven in this Marxist-Leninist kind of orientation that secured until the mid-1980s some kind of autonomy and independence from larger global capitalism until 1978, when this very same Ali Abdullah Saleh, then a junior player, an officer in the North Yemeni military, trained to some extent both in Iraq and Egypt, was brought to power after the assassination of who was most likely the last independent ruler of Yemen, of North Yemen. And so his arrival to the scene marks, in many ways, the beginning of what a political economist named Chaudhry in his book in 1997 said, the successful integration of Yemen into the global economy. And again, I've been highlighting in the last episode how strongly and persistently Yemenis resisted being exactly this, integrated into the exploitative economy of global capitalism. So what he says is that by the mid-1990s, Yemen, I'm quoting him now, Yemeni success in implementing a regime of taxation and regulation bespeaks the political capacity of an impoverished state to force compliance from a powerful and affluent private sector. So he's basically referring to Ali Abdullah Saleh and his rather loose alliance of what we would call, in let's say, studying political scientists like to identify parties. So his General People's Congress, the GPC, is often cited as the kind of mechanisms for which this process of successfully implementing a regime of taxation and regulation takes place. And as I highlighted last time, there were lots of outside forces desperately trying to seek Yemen's subordination, economic subordination, and it required a kind of compliant political elite. And what had long been used is this one recognized economic elite who could actually survive independently from this global capitalist economy, now beginning to be pressured by this, what often people are saying is a weak state, to actually become integrated through various systems of direct state taxation and the regulation of the Yemeni economy that has never before been possible, nor indeed wished by the ruling elite. So by independence, by the point of actual unification, 1990, we have to recall that in 1986, then Vice President George Bush Sr., who had once been the head of the CIA and an oil man through and through, went down and partnered with Ali Abdullah Saleh in forging a very expensive alliance, commercial alliance to develop North Yemen's oil industry. And that would ultimately extend after 1986 to South Yemen, which more or less was on its own with the collapse of the Soviet Union as a global power. And this is the context that now we need to understand the politics of today, because basically Yemen's kind of integration and formal regulation as a part of the larger global economy takes place at precisely the time when there is no other great power to balance off the incremental and often sometimes violent attempts by global capitalist interests to integrate Yemen. So Ali Abdullah Saleh has made himself the man through which the Americans and the big oil industry interests can actually go to. And he has proven throughout the early 1990s to not only continue availing Yemen's considerable carbon resources and increasingly also other mining resources, but he's also serving the political side of this enterprise, which is subduing the rest of Yemen. And he's doing this by first negotiating an alliance that leads to unification. For many Yemenis, this is the historical endpoint, right? This is what many people had long envisioned, a unified Southern Arabia. Emboldened by their history of successfully remaining independent from the larger world, very hostile to this rapacious expansionist neighbor to the north, Saudi Arabia, which has been cultivating a very much despised kind of distortion, if you will, of Islamic heritage, to the point where it was deemed a threat by, I would say, in the beginning of 1990, almost everyone in the political, cultural, and economic scene in Yemen. So Yemen, at least as it was articulating itself in the very dynamic newspaper culture that had emerged since the 1950s, to clearly those active Yemenis who are beginning to see from the diaspora an opportunity to come back and actually help a unified, empowered Yemen interact with the larger world as a regional power, at least. This all articulated very quickly into a new kind of policy orientation for Yemen's neighbors, especially Saudi Arabia. They basically saw the writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall manifested itself very quickly in the form of Saddam Hussein. And the almost natural alliance that Ali Abdullah Saleh's most important political assets, which included important actors from South Yemen, who did agree, in fact, to unify the two countries in 1990, probably under duress because they were economically failing and they had no access to finance that North Yemen had obviously secured with this alliance with the Bush people. So by 1990, Ali Abdullah Saleh and his, I think, still very principled, quite broad support embraced not only a hostile relationship towards Saudi Arabia in respect to Saudi Arabia's occupying Asir, I mentioned that in the last program, and there were certainly overtures to actually redrawing the boundaries to reintegrate parts of Yemeni territory at the expense of Saudi Arabia. But then more importantly, this conflict over resources. Recall that Saddam Hussein and Iraq had a territorial dispute, and not only a territorial dispute with Kuwait, but also a dispute over the use of a shared oil well. And this is precisely the kind of conflict that was on the horizon between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So while we don't have to replay the whole Iraq-Kuwait conflict and the consequences of Ali Abdullah Saleh's alliance, it was not really an alliance, but he basically said, why are we rushing to war? Why don't we negotiate a peaceful solution to this problem? After all, we're all Arab brothers. So the language of Arab unity, why are we fighting with each other? We have a common enemy in Israel. So again, this rush to war was very suspicious, right? Nevertheless, Yemen was punished by the expulsion of over 1 million Yemeni workers who were scattered throughout the Gulf countries at the time. And that created, almost at the time when they did not need it, to have a catastrophe inside Yemen, a newly unified Yemen. So you have over 1 million people sent back who were breadwinners for much of rural Yemeni society, now faced with the fact that they don't have an income. Much of their savings was stolen when they were deported from the Gulf. And more importantly, many of them are coming back with some of these rather crude, simplistic Salafist ideas about how Islam has been distorted over 1,500 years, and they had to basically return it to the founding fathers, if you will, what we would call Salafist. And not only Salafist, but along the lines of this Wahhabi kind of takfirism, which, again, was very alien to Yemen. The idea that Zaydis and Shafi and Maliki Muslims could not pray with each other, that they couldn't interact with each other, was completely beyond the imagination of Yemenis. But very quickly, a combination of an economic catastrophe caused by this forced deportation of over 1 million breadwinners, the diplomatic consequences of Ali Abdullah Saleh actually standing up against war in the Arab world, and then the influx of heavy investment in a very, let's say, antagonistic, at best, if you want to be generous, antagonistic and violently so, takfirism from the same countries that are punishing Yemen for daring to stand up to this war in the first place, means by 1993, when we have the first elections, a number of factors that were not there at the moment of this heightened sense of national pride, of unification, are suddenly on the table. And indeed, this master who knows how to dance on the heads of snakes recognizes this, and it's hard to tell if this is part of his master plan or if he's just adapting constantly to these shifting winds of regional, local, and global politics. I think it's more the latter. Ali Abdullah Saleh sees a window of opportunity, one to marginalize very popular elements from southern Yemen who were for the first time advocating not only social and cultural reforms in the form of distribution of tax money to take care of farmers with basically interest-free loans, providing education for even the most isolated rural communities, but also women's rights. South Yemen was very progressive in that regard, and women were very much part of social society. And your listeners may actually have seen pictures of women who are fully covered, even the full facial cover. And that's largely due to all these Yemeni families who have been forced back to Yemen from Saudi Arabia. This, again, was not a practice, even in North Yemen before. And so this is another kind of interesting impact and tension. Southern politicians are now evoking, that women not only should be educated and have a right to jobs, but also, this kind of very crude sectarian politics that is being exported from Saudi Arabia was also directly confronted in the larger political field, if you will. So before the elections in 1993, there was actually an interesting opportunity for southern political elites to become national parties, a unified Yemeni party, right? These old socialists. And this is something that Ali Abdullah Saleh knew immediately would be a disaster for his long-term survival. And so he partied and joined up forces with the rather more conservative elements. The most important is the Al-Ahmar family, from which he comes from their same region. It's still an open question whether his actually gaining access to power in 78 was a direct result of their contribution. He owed them something. It's not clear. But more or less his political alliance with what would become the most dominant, almost Muslim Brotherhood kind of element in Yemeni politics ever since, starts at this time when it became clear that southern Yemenis had actually attracted the attention of the progressive, if you will, instincts of northern Yemenis. So it's interesting because by 93, it was almost like a gift in many ways that this 1 million plus people were thrown out, because they came with very conservative ideas, or they understood global politics in different terms because they spent many years in Saudi Arabia or Qatar or elsewhere. And so it became clear that Ali Abdullah Saleh was offering them, perhaps with even overt suggestions that there are new opportunities once we consolidate power after the elections, that we can mend our relations with the Gulf countries. You can go back to your jobs in those countries, or at least we can bring some kind of political order which guarantees you a place in a unified Yemen. Because South Yemen was largely very much underpopulated. It was a very rich agricultural land. They had a great deal of potential in terms of mining, which would offer jobs, and most of the oil and gas was there. So northern Yemenis, who were mostly rural at this time still, who were in villages, mostly agricultural-based economy, was looking at the south as a potential source for, obviously, sharing the wealth of the south, but also an opportunity, as indeed happened, of migration. So many of these displaced former workers of the GCC are encouraged by Ali Abdullah Saleh to find means to settle in Aden, in Mukalla, in Hadramaut. And you begin to see these very same people who are politically charged, encouraged to keep their newly acquired Takfirist orientation, conservative religious orientation with them. And they basically infiltrate southern Yemen to the extent that southern Yemenis begin to realize they're being colonized. And they often use those terms. And this was the origins of ultimately what became the conflict of 1994, because Ali Abdullah Saleh was able to convince enough people across the board in northern Yemen who were conservative, or at least identified South Yemen still as somewhat alien, and was able to secure a reasonable victory over what many would argue the freest elections that Yemen had since unification. And this immediately meant a new kind of investment in infrastructure. My first time that I ever traveled to Yemen was 1992. And in 93, when I returned, the extent of the construction of roads connecting both north and south, extending all the way to the borders of Oman and all the way to through Saada and the Mahaimans, it was quite remarkable that new roads were being built, and you really got the sense that Yemen was being integrated. Now, for Southerners, unfortunately, the integration meant that they were being pushed aside locally by these, what they called colonialists. And this was the kind of charged domestic political rhetoric that after 1993 very quickly spiraled out of control and got to the point where it's ironic enough that many of these now very vocal, politically marginalized Southern leaders are actually getting whispers in their ears from, lo and behold, Saudi Arabia and other regional powers. You know what? Why don't you think about, you're not being satisfied politically. You're being economically marginalized. You have all the oil and gas. Why don't you say, we need to rethink this relationship? And it very quickly got to the point where they started shooting Scud missiles at each other. Unfortunately for the South Yemenis, their most important assets in the military. They were a very well-trained military. They terrified the region because there was a brief confrontation between unified Yemen and Saudi Arabia over some islands, and they handily defeated the Pakistani troops who normally serve as Saudi soldiers. And it became quite clear that Saudi Arabia over the long term would be facing a much more powerful, over 25 to 28 million people, oil-rich, militarily far more superior country in the south. So they had to do something. And unfortunately, the Americans complied. And the Americans most likely were also hesitant to see a regional country that historically had remained autonomous and impervious to American overtures throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so they certainly facilitated and encouraged this fragmentation politically.
And Isa, is this also why we see an influx of Al-Qaeda militants and allied forces like that as well, which seem to descend on Yemen in the 1990s? I mean, famously, this is Bin Laden's listening post was in Yemen. We have obviously the USS Cole bombing, which is one of the precursors to Al-Qaeda's eventual reign of terror around the world. So do you also kind of see the Saudi U.S. fingerprints on this as well? Because I mean, Al-Qaeda seems like something that to most Yemenis is quite distant. The doctrine, the sort of political rhetoric that Al-Qaeda preaches is not something that is familiar to most Yemenis, especially the fact that there's a lot. Al-Qaeda commits a lot of violence against Muslims in Yemen. And that kind of goes unchecked. And then, of course, this is all the more reason for the U.S. to get involved. So what do you make of that kind of introduction in the 90s?
Right. So, again, the context is important. The end of the Cold War, we know about the war in Afghanistan, in which Osama bin Laden was crucial in recruiting what we would call the Arab Afghans or the Arab fighters, many of whom actually came and were recruited from these Yemenis who were working in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden, of course, is from Hadramaut himself, his family at least. And then they had long commercial connections with that part of Yemen. So there was a lot of recruitment from there. And after 1990-91, when the Afghanistan became basically an extended civil war, many of these guys came back. They came back home. And again, they accompanied those million people who were thrown out. And as I said, that many of them brought with them Wahhabi Takfiri ideas. And so this is most likely how the Saudis and the Americans cultivated. And the fact Ali Abdullah Saleh embraced the more conservative forces of North Yemeni society, who would ultimately become this, what we would call today the Islah kind of version. And they're the ones who, in a place called Damaj, which is deeply in northern Yemeni and what we would call today Houthi territory, very in a provocative way, started the most visceral and hostile Takfiri school on all the Arabian Peninsula. So everyone from around the world would be given grants, scholarships from wealthy Saudis and Kuwaitis and Qataris to go study there. And they most likely were not only indoctrinated, but they also learned military tactics. And Ali Abdullah Saleh's special branch in the military and Secret Service were very much implicated in all this, as were the Americans. Because, again, they had been working together to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan and most likely in other places. And so this is where you have what we would call political Islam, the precursors to, as you call it, Al-Qaeda, to have an imprint on the domestic politics of Yemen, obviously an imprint on the larger global political scene as well. And it's Ali Abdullah Saleh, after successfully defeating South Yemenis, who, again, seemed to get at certain points of time, some of their leaders were sent back from Saudi exile or from Beirut, and they lost and they went off again to exile. South Yemen was more or less completely taken over, and again, taken over by the most angry types of Takfiris who didn't belong traditionally in Yemeni culture. but suddenly became very much a big part of the day-to-day life. And they took over villages. They had very dedicated members of these who created these communities. They intermarried, or they brought family members from elsewhere in the world. And you begin to see these pockets of very isolated, the equivalents to these special camps that you would have in the 60s. I would say almost along the lines of hippie kind of enclaves, right? Who were following some charismatic leader. And not all of them were viscerally violent. They were what we call quietist Salafists, who were also kind of emerging, and most of them were Yemenis themselves. So they would still embrace this idea: we must return back to tradition. They were against Sufism, and certainly against Zaydi Fiver Shiism, as they call it. But they were not necessarily about violence, and they certainly wouldn't countenance murdering fellow Muslims. But the other brands, who were getting most of the money, who were getting the weapons, and who were clearly, whenever called upon, willing to go to other parts of the Islamic world to fight and kill other Muslims. I mean, more recently, Libya, Iraq, Syria are examples. But before that, it was Sudan, right? They would go to Darfur and take care of these other groups. It would be in Somalia. Somalia was around this time finally blown up. And many of these forces were trained in these pockets in Yemen. And again, it's all under the nose of American intelligence. Ali Abdullah Saleh is politically rewarded with making alliances with these types. And there's less pressure put on him after 1994. He's become the ascendant power. His vice president ever since, this guy named Hadi, helped in many ways facilitate the transfer of much of the southern military power into the hands of what was then a much more modest North Yemeni military capacity. And they start now in the mid-1990s, because now they're pumping oil, right? There is some money coming from the oil. Then they're able to borrow money off of future oil production. And that's crucial for Saleh's expansion of what he was hoping to be a more professional, what they call the special government forces, which would be more or less loyal to him in the GPC, the General People's Congress. So Yemen as a unified country didn't last very long. And it became a country actually fragmented along regions, but not by people who are loyal to those regions, but by regions of let's say, levels of state control, direct control, indirect control, and more importantly, about violence. So there were certain areas that would see lots of day-to-day violence at the local level between neighbors. Many of these colonists, as Southerners would call them, who come from the north or who came being exiled from the Gulf, had very hostile relations with their indigenous neighbors. In North Yemen, you begin to see the phenomena of more and more people having, because of the economic reforms that are being imposed now by Ali Abdullah Saleh, in return for his political safety, he's making concessions to the IMF, to the World Bank. So there's more land privatization, laws are being rewritten, communities are breaking up their lands, converting their lands more and more to cash crops. People are borrowing money off the land and losing them to lenders. So you're seeing a dramatic social-economic transformation of Yemen in its entirety. And you begin to see massive urbanization for the first time. And you had modestly sized cities throughout the north and in one or two cities in the south, but you really begin to see now, with all these uprooted people coming and creating slums in Sana'a and Taiz and Ib and Hodeidah. And that's also something quite new. And as much with the rest of the third world that had been facing this depopulation of the countryside already since the 60s, it has had direct consequences to how politics were performed. Political parties could very easily access large groups of people who are clustered in these slums. You begin to see, again, Saudi money come and indoctrinate people who are coming to pick up free food every night.
Right.
Classic tactic to indoctrinate the next generation of takfiris. And Yemen is being integrated into the kind of ugly side of exploitative capitalism in other ways. I mean, this takes place really in its most obvious form a little bit later when you begin to see the phenomena of cheap airline flights from the Gulf. But Yemen increasingly becomes a playground for not the rich. The rich would always go to southern France or Spain or to Beirut, but the middle class or the lower middle class from the Gulf would find cheap sex or temporary marriages, which would in the Gulf. In Yemen. And this is the place where you can just sit around and chew khat all day long, and most likely drink, and most likely have very good food. It's a very cheap, long weekend kind of fun and games for young men. Mm. So unfortunately, the disasters in Somalia and in Ethiopia led to large numbers of desperate people coming from the Horn of Africa, and that certainly contributed to a different kind of exploitative economy where you have lower scale laborers really taking care of some of the most undesirable kinds of operations, and of course the availability of cheap women made this a very seedy side to the Yemeni economy, which no one's really talked about. And I don't quite know why. And probably because of those who are implicated, right? The ones who are exploiting this are largely coming from the Gulf.
The sort of sex tourism side to parts of Yemen is, like you said, is just not at all explored, and I think that, like you said, I guess people have this image of they understand the rich Saudi princes on yachts on the French Riviera and places like that, and we've heard those sort of stories. But like you said, the availability of prostitutes from places like Somalia or Ethiopia or Eritrea that are in parts of Yemen, and also you mentioned before, that alcohol is it's available more so in Yemen than in Saudi Arabia or any of these other Gulf places, and also a lot of people do chew khat like all the time, like you said, to a young upper middle class guy in Saudi Arabia, that probably it sounds very enticing. But it's a very overlooked aspect to all of this, and again, it's just like not at all like the culture of Yemen. Very, very quickly, Isa, what the whole khat topic gets a lot of play in Western media. Is it as much of a scourge on Yemen as many people talk about it? It has this portrayal as being the worst thing ever. And I'll just say this, here in New York, especially in Brooklyn, every deli that is run by Yemeni immigrants all chew khat, all the time. I've never, so my experience with it is fairly limited, but I've never seen it as like this, horrible, evil thing. Just briefly talk about khat, because I know listeners and stuff have asked about that.
Yeah, well, most likely, I too once lived in New York and enjoyed a couple of sessions of chewing khat, and it's coming in daily. When Yemenia used to fly to New York, that would come on Yemenia flights, so you would have good homegrown khat. This one's probably coming from Ethiopia, the stuff they're chewing now, and there's this daily flight from Addis Ababa, and there's an interesting market component to all this, and certainly market. Women started to chew very actively. It was basically a social kind of, what people do. Do Americans socialize anymore? I don't know. But let's say when they used to do that, they would go for a coffee, right? And they would sit around or drink wine or something. You would have some clerics who would decry the impact that it has over the long term of people's willingness to work. I find actually Yemenis are incredibly industrious. They may be hanging around and they're talking and smoking cigarettes and chewing khat for 8 hours on, but they're also wide awake for all that time, and many of them do end up working while also under the influence of khat. Many a Westerner certainly fell in love with that lifestyle, and I lost a couple of students to the Mafraj scene in Yemen while they were supposed to study Arabic in the late 1990s. But what's beautiful about it is actually it forges communities. I mean, this is what anthropologists who actually had sympathy for Yemen would actually study, and this is how you would learn everything about Yemeni society. You just sit in on an event where neighbors and extended family at least the men, are talking with each other in one room. And you're there for long periods of time. For long periods of time, no one says anything. But and then there are these kind of moments of communication. And this is how deals are made. This is how alliances are made or broken. It's never violence. I mean, you have really serious arguments. It's very philosophical. I mean, Yemenis are quite erudite and very clever with their language, something that also terrifies the Gulf because they are at the intellectual level far more developed and articulate and confident than their Gulf neighbors. So that's also an interesting component to this visceral campaign to destroy Yemen today. This is a window of opportunity to undermine those people who have long historically been the kind of guardians of Islam, the ones who have disseminated Islam and gave it its human face for millennia. And these are also incredibly creative people who these moments of sitting down and socializing, chewing khat is a quite remarkable thing to have. And to be attacked so viscerally by social conservatives who don't like the consumption of what is a mild stimulant. I mean, it suppresses hunger, and you could basically go on. You don't need to sleep. But this has been chewed before Islam, and I'm not quite sure that we could argue that the founding communities decried it either. I mean, this is something that everyone who rides camel trading would be chewing on, right? Nevertheless, it is something that does have, however, an unfortunate strain on the economy. Increasingly, as the lands were being uprooted from communities and people had to basically sell their plots, more and more family plots were sold because people wanted cash or needed cash, because it became increasingly a cash-based economy with all these so-called reforms that Saleh is helping to be imposed on Yemen. The consolidation of very productive land and is increasingly used for this very profitable product, which, by the way, is sold for much higher prices. The profits margins are quite impressive when they get smuggled into Saudi Arabia every day. Still do, most likely. It just makes economic sense to why grow tomatoes when we can get cheap tomatoes in this globalized economy, and we can get from neighboring Ethiopia on the same day freshly picked tomatoes. Let's grow this khat and we can triple our money. Unfortunately, it takes up a lot of water, and they spray a lot of nasty chemicals, which I assure you the big agricultural chemical companies are very happy about, even though the embassy, on one side of their mouth says, this is horrible, has horrible consequences in society. They're also selling them the very same things that are necessary to expand the production of this land. And again, banks love it, right? This is the whole idea. We want to maximize the returns. They just wanted to get their hands on the profits. And so that became sometimes a problem when the profits were consolidated around guys who translated this money to political influence. And they were definitely independent often. And again, this drives the Americans and the British and the Saudis crazy that they can't buy some of these people. And these people are very principled. They do not like Saudis. They do not like Salafist politics. And they certainly increasingly realize the Americans are part of the problem. So this is interesting, and it plays itself out in areas where the drone warfare starts to take place, where the so-called war on terrorism, which is being cultivated and exploited, and it serves very nicely this continued Orientalist kind of impression that is disseminating in Western media, that the Middle East is the source of all evil. You have these evil, dark, scary types who are now running around putting bombs in Khartoum and blowing up embassies in East Africa and attacking one of our ships. We have to go get them. And again, it creates this window of opportunity for Ali Abdullah Saleh to, on one hand, help these Salafist groups because they help politically keep law and order, or even indeed extend influence of the state, meaning Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen context. It secures more of the natural resources for his regional and global partners. It avails much of this land to the market, if you want to keep it in those terms. So this so-called free world economy has become very well integrated thanks to Ali Abdullah Saleh. And in the meantime, the Americans are beginning to explore the use of drone warfare. And they have certainly special forces who are down there training this special Republican Guard that would be basically loyal to Ali Abdullah Saleh ever since. Or at least that's what we've been told. And so the war of terrorism plays itself out for the first time in Yemen, and probably in a more interesting way than in Somalia or in Afghanistan, because again, it's basically at the same time where you have the key assets for these future wars in Iraq, then Syria, Libya, elsewhere, are being cultivated more or less in the same country that the so-called war is expanding. And what I've long insisted on, and it just frustrates me to no end, and I'm very suspicious as to why this has never been explored by journalists like Scahill or others, is that the ones who have been targeted, they're not the Islamic radicals that we're being told. We hear about the stories of a wedding been killed and innocent civilians are killed amongst the targeted local leader of Al Qaeda. Well, it turns out that the local who has been hit is actually a political rival to Ali Abdullah Saleh, right? And this is how they basically very quietly eliminated rivals. And whether or not the Americans can claim in the end that they were innocent in all this, that the embassy and their people on the ground did not know whom they were hitting, and that they were just getting advice from Ali Abdullah Saleh's intelligence, that's beside the point in the end, because the result is that none of the guys who were there to function as the easy target rhetorically for this war on terrorism, they were not the targets in reality. The targets were political rivals, and that for me is the most insidious side of this war on terrorism as it plays out elsewhere. And I think one begins to realize if you look more closely at what's happening in Syria today. It's no longer possible to make this line. You can't actually talk about the war on terrorism and not say and be skeptical about its rhetorical use. In Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh exploits it. There's more and more money that no longer for development, but it's going directly for the fighting war on terrorism. So his military side, his sons, himself, his Al-Ahmar allies, Ali Muhsin Al-Ahmar becomes a very powerful man who has his own somewhat private army. So by the beginning of 2000s, many principled Yemenis throughout the country are saying this is really a terrible situation. And one of them are this very outspoken parliamentarian from the Northwest, that same area that the Saudis had all kinds of problems with since 1934. And we would call him Houthi. Right? He's the kind of patriarch of this whole so-called Houthi movement, and he became a champion for decency, for good politics, for against corruption, against this kind of innovative economic packages that the World Bank has got Ali Abdullah Saleh to sign up on. Certainly against this takfirism, there was this Damaj school system that was just spewing out the most visceral, nasty Takfiri politics and violence. And so he became this kind of hero in many ways. First in Sana'a politics, then he was basically pushed out, and then from regionally in this northwest part of Yemen that has been basically at loggerheads ever since, and has been targeted by the Saudis, the Americans, through Ali Abdullah Saleh, through these Takfiri assets. I mean, there's been constant violence on this region, first and foremost by terrorist attacks, right? Assassination attempts, murder, outright violence with these armed militias, and then periodically, over the course of the 2000s, Ali Abdullah Saleh's military direct action using this one most notorious Ali Muhsin Al-Ahmar. But if you recall, I briefly mentioned the fact that in 2000, the Americans, Saudi Arabia, and Ali Abdullah Saleh come to agree to militarize the border. There was something that they were nervous about, the loose travel between both sides of the border of that whole area from the Red Sea coast inwards. Much of the areas that used to be South Yemen bordering with Saudi Arabia was unmarked, actually. That's actually where probably the largest oil and gas fields are in all of the Arabian Peninsula, and they have not been touched because previously the British didn't want to tap into them, and Yemen did not have the money to tap into it, but they would never allow Saudis to tap into it, or Aramco. So basically the Americans, Saudi Arabia, and Ali Abdullah Saleh come to an agreement in 2000 to actually draw a boundary, and more importantly start building this militarized fence and extend Saudi/American mercenary power into Yemeni territory. So this became basically a sovereignty issue for many of these same people who are not Zaidi entirely. People began to recognize that the struggle against corruption, the struggle against Ali Abdullah Saleh, against political Islam, was a national one. And it was shared by people both from the south and the north. And this has been the problem ever since, is that so-called scholars working on Yemen, certainly State Department types, and certainly newspaper journalists who often get their information from the State Department or Saudi propaganda apparatus, refer to this simply as a Houthi struggle against the central state, right, against law and order. And that's, again, a useful ploy, which only recently added to this mix. They threw Iran in, right? Because Zaydis somehow are Shia, even though they have nothing to do with 12 or Shiism of Iran, and never did, and very little today, in fact. And so, unfortunately, this whole region that was brought together, not because of any sectarian loyalty, definitely not one loyalty to one man. They did not share anything other than the resistance, the kind of articulation of resistance. And this was a broad coalition of very different communities. And I keep insisting on this fact when I write about this in the book, is that this is not a Houthi movement. This is not a movement of Zaydis against majority Shafi Sunnis. This is actually about a very popular uprising against global forces that manifests in Yemen in this regime that, whenever it's necessary, uses political Islam to go after enemies, uses American drones to go after enemies, and is exploiting the economy to the extent that natural resources are going off to pliable outside interests. And Yemenis are getting poorer and poorer. They're facing water crisis, especially in this northwest part. It feels more or less isolated. They used to have people working in the Gulf and bringing in money every year. That's been blocked. So it is a struggle for economic justice, political justice, and a correction to what was once, not very long ago, a dream come true for many Yemenis, a unified country that would actually stand up to its neighbors, remain independent, and maintain a decent lifestyle, if you will, not in terms of material wealth. Yemenis never had the kind of material quality of life that the West insists is the only criteria for success, but they had strong families, they had strong communities, they had this interesting kind of way of understanding the world, and that has consistently been hostile to the crass capitalist, expansionist, hegemonic kind of policies promoted through neoliberalism, through globalization, through its local agents, Takfiri Islam, Saudi Arabia, etc.
Let me jump in right there, Isa, because we're coming up right on the break. So we'll continue this conversation in the second hour, but we are speaking with Associate Professor Isa Blumi of Stockholm University's Department of Asian, Middle Eastern, and Turkish Studies. His new book, which is out through University of California Press, is Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. And we will continue this conversation in the second hour, so please stay tuned.
Welcome to the world's meeting place. American.
It's practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes. I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Since the beginning, civilizations have risen and fallen. Rome, ancient Persia, Mongolia, Britain, and now America. Befallen by natural disasters, broken families, moral decay, lack of preparedness and conflict. Don't let this happen to you. Are you prepared? Would you like to help others prepare? AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com is looking for distributors. Email bugoutamerica@usa.com. Go to AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, a veteran-owned and operated company. But do it today.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me in American Freedom Radio. Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology, they have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
And when we're not invading some sovereign nation or setting it on fire from the air, which is more fun for our Nintendo pilots, then we're usually declaring war on something here at home. Did you ever notice that about us? We love to declare war on things here in America. Anything we don't like about ourselves, we declare war on it. We don't do anything about it. We just declare war on it. It's the only metaphor we have in our public discourse for solving problems, declaring war. We have to declare war on everything. We have a war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on litter, the war on cancer, the war on drugs. But you ever notice we got no war on homelessness? Huh? No war on homelessness. You know why? There's no money in that problem. No money to be made off of the homeless. If you could find a solution to homelessness where the corporate swine and the politicians could steal a couple of $1 million each, you see the streets of America begin to clear up pretty quick. I'll guarantee you that. I will guarantee you that.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control is good. 5, roger copy. 3, 2, 1. Engage.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redmond. If you are joining us here in the second hour, we are speaking with Associate Professor Isa Blumi of Stockholm University's Department of Asian, Middle Eastern, and Turkish Studies. His new book, which is out right now on University California Press, which I highly recommend people go out and get a copy of, is Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. And of course, we will link up to that in the show notes. Isa, we kind of towards the end of the first hour there, I think we'd more or less kind of gotten up to the political situation, which was sort of unraveling around 2011 when Saleh's hold on Yemen seemed a bit more tenuous than it normally had, and which is funny because Saleh seemed to periodically kind of bring Yemen to the brink of chaos and then would kind of reel it back in. And that seemed to be something that he used as as like a release valve or as just a way to continually consolidate power. Whereas in 2011, this seemed to kind of go beyond his control. And I want to get your take on the large-scale protests that we saw in Yemen around that time. This is the infamous quote-unquote Arab Spring. And, I certainly have my questions and my doubts about the validity or the organic nature of a lot of the Arab Spring, particularly in Egypt, where we see a lot of nefarious groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Republican and Democrat Institutes, which are long been, ways for the CIA and State Department to funnel money into activist groups. And we saw them being very active in Egypt and also Tunisia. And certainly, the way the Arab Spring played out in Libya was absolutely completely controlled or puppeteered by the U.S., France, England, and some other NATO countries. But what's your take on what happened in Yemen? Because while I have a lot of doubts about some aspects of it, or I have some questions, the stuff in Yemen seemed to be a bit more organic than what we saw in, say, North Africa. And maybe that's just my own bias towards Yemen and towards, the politics of Yemen. But what do you make of that? Because it seemed to me, from an outsider at least, looking in on it, this really seemed like the natural culmination of what had been going on within the Yemeni political and economic system. Where this just was, there was no way around it. This had to happen. Support for Saleh had become so soured. The country had become so divided in the north. You were just mentioning with the Houthi movement sort of taking full swing. In the south, during that time, the same thing. I mean, there were southern secessionists in Yemen talking about splitting. Dividing Yemen back into a southern, Marxist state in the midst of these protest movements. So, Isa, explain to the listeners what was going on in 2011, what led to this.
Yes. Exactly. What led to it? I have to actually take us through the 2000s very quickly because it's the only way we can account for why what took place was actually something that was terrified the larger powers and basically made clear that Ali Abdullah Saleh had been flirting with chaos for too long, using, as you said rightfully, using the kind of chaotic conditions to constantly shift power and make sure that violence would be the only means to assure stability in an otherwise disastrous country to breaking apart in different fragments. It's the economic exploitation, the heavy investment by UAE from the late 1990s onwards by Qatar into developing parts of Sana'a for these exclusive kind of neighborhoods that would become again the playground, especially when it's hot up in the Gulf countries. The idea of building these enclaves overlooking Sana'a was very much on the agenda for Qatari money. Qatar had invested heavily in these political actors who would, by this stage, guys like Zindani and Ahmar were clearly Muslim Brotherhood types that were also cultivated by the Qataris in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere. Strong support from segments of the U.S. embassy who were close to the Clinton and the Bush administration period. Lots of money from Qatar went and ended up in London and Washington, D.C., with think tanks, with lawyers, with lobbying groups. And Qatar was nevertheless a minor player to the larger successes of the UAE to start signing treaties with Ali Abdullah Saleh's permission to develop much of the southern infrastructure. And this is where basically southern separatists emerge. They're saying, you guys have been stealing our lands, and now you're signing these leases with Dubai Ports World. This is the time now before the crash of 2007, 2008, where Dubai is the big thing, right? It is third world money going to Dubai to invest in property development. And there's lots of money circulating around, and they're able to translate that to becoming a big player in Yemen's economy. And they're doing it very wisely. And if you remember last time I mentioned that many of the leading families in the UAE consider themselves Yemeni.
Right.
Because after 67, many fled when the country became independent. They fled to what was still British trucial states. And they slowly started intermarrying with the ruling elite of these still British territories of what later became the UAE. No, they've come of age by the 1990s, 2000s. They're very much benefiting from this huge influx of global investment, lots of cheap money coming their way, and they're translating into going back home and buying up Yemen's most lucrative assets. And this is frustrating to no ends those increasingly impoverished southerners who see they've lost entirely this opportunity to be a player in unified Yemen. They're seeing the oil and gas industry explode in investment. There were at some point in time in the early 2000s when oil was really well over $100, and there was so much money circulating around, and there was so much corruption. I actually, in my book, tell the story about how the percentage of every barrel was being sliced off by these partners that were connected with Ali Abdullah Saleh, and they're making hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It's creating a huge imbalance in Yemeni society. So by 2007, you have this separatist movement, Hirak, emerging in the underground, in the diaspora. You have this ongoing wars in the northwest, which Ali Abdullah Saleh is exploiting to gain even further control, ironically enough, through chaos. That was my first book on Yemen, called Chaos in Yemen, arguing that there's this kind of paradox where you're actually using chaotic situations to justify a more investment by outside players to rely on you, Ali Abdullah Saleh's GPC, to keep law and order in Yemen and expand, in fact, the development of the kind of economy that doesn't need a stable state anymore, right? And that's certainly the case with Libya and Syria and Iraq today. They're still exporting oil, right, but it's not going to central government, right? It's going to these players who are in Zurich and who are, putting 300,000 barrels of oil into ships that are waiting offshore. And that was certainly the case with Yemen, a big scandal in mid-2000s. It ultimately led to Ali Abdullah Saleh clashing directly with these key former allies. And that's when we begin to see the split between Ali Abdullah Saleh and his what were once very good, useful partners amongst the Muslim Brotherhood, the Qataris. And I would suggest the Qataris, again, have long-term ambitions that are conflicting with Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Yemen. And their heavy investment in the Islah Party, in a woman named Tawakkol Karman, who won ultimately the Peace Prize as a reward for her role in the 2011 events, She was part of this whole youth organization, the training of a new generation of activists by George Soros, the Open Society, the USAID, the same ones that had an influence in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria. And it's interesting because in many ways, some of them were very much progressive, open-minded, and naive. They were used. They were exploited for their energy. Whilst there were others who were much more ideologically stable. They were doing things in stealth, and hopefully to actually take advantage, to ride the wave of youth energy, to change things, to bring a new order to these societies. And the idea was not necessarily to see Yemen fall completely into chaos, but at least to initiate a change of regime. Ali Abdullah Saleh had been there long enough. There was plenty of hundreds of billions of dollars that had been stolen at some point in time, and who knows where it all went. And more importantly, the UAE is getting a little bit too powerful and influential. And indeed, there's suggestions that this separatist movement even has some kind of support. So the Qatar has to step in. The Americans have to step in. And it becomes even more clear that by 2011, the consequences of all this exploitative economy, all this violence in all these regions, the growing slums of the big cities, of the north in particular, translated very quickly into, much like elsewhere, almost a spontaneous and perhaps less, let's say, managed, if you will. They certainly jumped to try to manage it very quickly. You noticed how quickly certain kinds of journalists stepped in and gave a character. They characterized it in some way, right? This whole reference to the Arab Spring, the way they identified the good activists, the young activists, and the bad ones, right? And then basically you saw an interesting management, if you will, of youth movement. But what's so interesting about Yemen is that it broke off very quickly into very distinctive factions. You had loyalists to Ali Abdullah Saleh, but you had also people who were now inspired by what we would call the Houthi, which is again a problematic term, but it's much more a broader coalition. And then you basically see that Ali Abdullah Saleh is not controlling Yemen anymore. And there's the threat that you may actually have these real nationalists, those who still have the capacity to inspire people along the lines of, we can actually remain independent, we can win back our country, we can redirect our country away from globalization. And this was something that could not happen. You could not have what in Egypt, what could have very easily been a populist uprising, right? I mean, it starts with bread riots. No one gives a shit about. Sorry, we're not on AM anymore, right? No
yeah, you can curse. That's fine. That's all right.
Yeah. No one gives a damn about people who are hungry due to IMF reforms. But in Egypt, for instance, the middle class started getting into it during the crash of beginning of 2011, the stock market crashed, and they lost all their savings, and that's when they actually had to take contingency. And Muslim Brotherhood served perfectly that role of subduing what could have easily been a real revolution in Egypt. It could have been very much the same thing in Yemen. And here you can see very clearly what the media is doing. They've already latched on to this Tawakkol Karman. They're already steering the international community to think about it in terms of, here is the leader of this movement, where in fact there are factions in each of the cities. Different squares are occupied by different groups. There is violence. There is this kind of very suspicious, why would a sniper on top of a hill, top of a building start shooting at this particular group? And, what's the point behind that? Was it to instigate, a more violent response, to kind of push things in certain directions, to invite intervention? Anyway, the point is that Ali Abdullah Saleh proved that he was no longer the man for the job. If you recall the very beginning of this segment, the man for the job in Yemen was to assure the integration of Yemen into the global exploitative economy. And Ali Abdullah Saleh did that masterfully. And it seemed that his time was up, that there was a new generation in waiting that was needed to be brought in to continue this phase, because there were just too many fragments going in different directions now. There was a discontinuity. There was this competition between Gulf states and with very different relations with Yemen. there is this larger phenomenon of global phenomena, what we would call today Al Qaeda, Daesh, or ISIS, that's coming at play, and it's not quite certain what's going to happen in Yemen, and they have to take control of the affairs because it's a very rich country, and more importantly, if it gets out of control, it could easily spill into neighboring Saudi Arabia. And lo and behold, international community intervenes. They negotiate Ali Abdullah Saleh to step aside. It doesn't hurt that there was an assassination attempt on him, most likely by his former allies, the Islah people, who in the meantime were busy assassinating leaders of the so-called Houthi alliance, which again extends well beyond any Zaidi constituency. It's a larger Yemen-wide phenomena of support for this movement to bring Yemen back to a unified country, to rewrite the laws, to gain more control over sovereignty over the country's economy, to encourage farmers to go back to their lands, et cetera, et cetera. And so Ali Abdullah Saleh is pushed aside. He has to go and get treated for his horrible wounds, and this is when Tawakkol Karman gets awarded. She and her allies are basically propped up by Al Jazeera, which is, of course, an extension of the Qatari state. You have rival kind of narratives about what was happening in Yemen alongside what's happening in other countries at this time. And in the meantime, the Americans are heavily, and the others are heavily invested in making sure that the process continues where Yemen remains a most important kind of viable partner in global capitalist expansion into the country, especially its resources. Again, its offshore resources have not been tapped yet. It's oil and gas just awaits for the right kind of moment for massive investment again. And the last thing that these interested parties need is for this country to go independent, to push away from this. And so all the necessary assets are brought in. Just remember that also there's the economic crisis that certainly was not resolved by 2011, right? The 2008 disaster for the larger world, the dramatic concentration of wealth in smaller and smaller hands, the struggle with the BRICS countries, right? Britain, Russia, India. I would even include Indonesia and Iran in this, China and South Africa. There's still an element of that rivalry, that potential rivalry. The fact that China had invested huge amounts of money with Ali Abdullah Saleh and some of these same mining assets really highlighted the threat that, in fact, Ali Abdullah Saleh may actually have been going and again, dancing on snakes' heads, realizing that the shift in power, China is the new game in town. Maybe the BRICS dynamic and component started to play into his strategic calculations. Maybe this is why he and his Muslim Brotherhood allies started falling apart. There are all kinds of what ifs, but he attacked the big guys he had once partnered with. He took away their assets and their control over Yemeni oil. And in the meantime, the poor are getting poorer and they rise up. And it basically makes it clear that Ali Abdullah Saleh is no longer a player in this. They bring in his vice president. The process in 2012 is they have this one-man election, which is, of course, a complete joke.
Which Hillary Clinton, praises as this wonderful.
Oh, yeah,
and there's literally one guy on the ballot. I mean, there's not even like like when Mubarak or even when Sisi runs now. There's at least a few people. There's at least the facade of there being something else, but literally it's just Hadi on the ballot and continue.
Yeah, and this is, again, just perhaps a miscalculation because there was probably an opportunity, even though there was certainly violence on the streets throughout 2011, there was certainly an opportunity for someone, for some actor to say, look, we've accomplished what at least we brought this issue to the surface. We've removed the Saleh family. It's time to actually pursue reforms, to actually bring back some law and order to this economy. to Yemen's relationship to its neighbors, which is, again, not to service the outside world's exploitative economy, right? I mean, you really did have people who were speaking in those terms of, we've been being plundered and we have to stop it. And of course, that's exactly what the GCC, the UN, the EU, and the Americans wanted most to continue. And that's why they put their viable man. They brought in the next best thing, Hadi, who was, subordinate to Saleh for over 20 years. He has no political base of his own. He's entirely dependent on, as we can see today, right? He lives in a hotel room in Riyadh with no support whatsoever. And indeed, if he had to run against a donkey, I'm pretty sure the donkey would have won, considering Yemeni's sense of humor. So they really did have to run him alone. And it's not by mistake that in the process of this, we were supposed to usher in a period of 2 years, an interim period, where she would help lead a national dialogue Congress, an attempt to actually write a new constitution that would address some of what Tawakkol Karman expressed were Yemeni's complaints. They never bothered to allow members of the Hirak, the southern separatists, or what we would call the Houthis, those big groups of people from the northwest who had been fighting all these years against the violence of the Saleh regime. They were never included in this process. So you have this bunch of well-positioned Yemeni elite with some members of civil society, which was, of course, at this time in American imperialism, a very useful tool of influence, right? They always had their hands in funding these NGOs. Mm-hmm. They loved this kind of politics because they could influence these small groups of ambitious young people to basically fall in line rhetorically about democracy and rights and all these kinds of things, which mean nothing in real politics, and certainly has nothing to do with shaping the direction of Yemeni's economy. And it's not by surprise that the first thing that Hadi, the now elected president, the legitimate president of the UN, and again, China has to be faulted here. They sat on their hands, in Russia too. They didn't object, they didn't veto, they said this is not our sphere of influence. The first thing he did is that Yemen's going to sign with the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and that initiated a process of even further aggrandizing the exploitation of Yemen's economy. It expedited the process of privatization, of foreign ownership of land, which was, for a long time deemed constitutionally impossible to own certain kinds of strategic assets. What still remained of the state companies and the state properties, especially around the ports of Aden and Hodeidah, were all privatized and sold. And what's crucial in all this, he also started to attacking especially UAE assets. The UAE, which had, like I said, secured leases through the Dubai ports world of managing much of the infrastructure of Aden, this potentially very important Indian Ocean port that's at the mouth of the Red Sea, and the access to the Suez Canal, and lots of oil that's just awaiting to be exploited. He rips up the contracts of Dubai that Dubai Ports World has. Some of the mining contracts that were very lucrative for UAE companies in the 2000s also declared null and void. They were illegally secured, and basically issuing new bids and granting them to Qatari and Saudi companies instead. In the meantime, what has already started in the mid-2000s is experimentation with microfinancing, right? Pushed by Deutsche Bank and the Amal Bank, is again reintegrated into the scheme. Yemenis are being increasingly encouraged to borrow money off of future productivity, putting up their whole community's land up for collateral, which of course then very conveniently someone defaults in the land and goes off, into possession of the bank. There's all kinds of overtures to revisiting the construction of these big projects by Qatari development companies for making parts of Sana'a like Dubai, basically entertainment zones for the rich and the wealthy, and includes, of course, once again, the sex tourism, which I mentioned before. And you see throughout after 2011, 2012, 2013, there is this advertised process of negotiation over what's the future constitution, in which large segments of Yemen's opposition to Saleh were not even invited to participate in. You see this almost expedited, almost doubled in urgency, privatization of Yemen's economy, the distribution of Yemen's resources to Saudis and Qatar, translates into some of these rather interesting, ambitious projects at this stage as well, where, for instance, the Bin Laden group was suggesting to build a bridge that connects Djibouti with Yemen that would facilitate the exploitation of Ethiopia's farmlands, which the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, as they increasingly start thinking about food security, see the Horn of Africa as an ideal place to actually buy up lands. They put the right kind of political leadership in Addis Ababa at the time. There was the beginning of the construction of the dam of the Blue Nile, which would create huge water surplus, the big lake, which then could be very easily tapped into with a pipeline that would bring both foods on trucks and trains, which was built by the Chinese, to the Djibouti port. Along this bridge, crossed into this very flat coastal areas, which is now being fought over around Hodeidah right now. It would not surprise me if the war could in some way stop if they could actually ever conquer this part of Yemen, connecting the end of the Arabian Peninsula with the border with Saudi Arabia. Well, that's not going to happen, and I can maybe explain in the next 20 minutes. But let me quickly just give you an example of these other kinds of projects. It's just this almost on speed. They're really not jumping into these ambitions to completely transform Yemen, to basically push Yemen sovereignty aside and make the Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia, into the major East African player as well. And there was this idea with this Saudi 2030 to build, much like Dubai had built these kinds of cities along the Red Sea coast. And they were talking about 30 million people metropoli, along the Red Sea coast, with Sudan also being a player, China's relationship with Sudanese government in terms of developing its oil and its own ports. So it was a kind of, in a regional sense, there was something happening, and it can only happen with Yemen being food. And this is something that they were hoping with first Saleh, proved not possible. Now they were hoping that Hadi would be able to do that, quiet down the opposition, let them sit on their hands as new realities were being basically put on the ground. The problem is that the result was it was shutting out UAE. The problem is that they were shutting out the vast majority of Yemen's opposition in the first place. So you begin to see when the 2-year period is up for Hadi, he basically says, well, our work is not done yet. So we're just going to arbitrarily extend my mandate for 2 more years. And that's when basically the opposition, which would agree to keep quiet, to sit down quietly and wait this process out, said, okay, enough is enough. And they took to the streets. They started violence again. They were first fighting with these now ISIS forces. Al-Qaeda and Daesh has now made their presence known in Yemen, just like in Syria and Iraq. And so while the violence between Takfiris and the so-called Houthis in the north and the separatists in the south, it quickly translates into a race to fight this corrupt proxy government that the GCC and the Americans had propped up in the name of Hadi. And lo and behold, there is widespread support. I mean, basically, it's a walkover. They're able to go very quickly into Sana'a. They go all the way down to Aden. They're already defeating these Al-Qaeda forces that had mysteriously been able to very openly, control whole swaths of land in Yemen. They were all being immediately eliminated. This was clearly a very popular movement that was embraced by large numbers across many different so-called divides in Yemen, supported by a lot of people. And it took the most, I think, obvious form by those who started speaking on behalf. It was called Ansar Allah, which again today it's being unfortunately very crudely and strategically tied with Houthi and therefore Iranians, where it's in fact a much broader coalition, again, resisting this subordination of Yemen, the destruction of Yemen, the exploitation of this chaos in Yemen by global forces. And once again, by 2014, they arrest Hadi. He resigns. The UN has sent a representative on there. So by early 2015, while everyone is up in arms in the outside world, because again, the newspapers are reporting it as they hope, as they wish them to report it. This is an Iranian move. Hezbollah has now taken over Yemen. Exactly. It's these guys who, again, represent a very interesting crossover of Yemeni society, are defeating Takfiri forces throughout Yemen. They're occupying the big cities. They've forced Hadi to resign. They're already investigating the incredible corruption that had been taking place over the last 3 years. They have suppressed the violence that had been emerging in Yemen on the streets. There were lots of assassinations. Many Zaidi mosques were being attacked. People, while they were praying, were being attacked. You can go back and look at the media. That occasionally would be reported in the West. But again, it's already quite clear that there's a narrative about Yemen that cannot be countenanced to be shared with the outside world. And these people are not going to stand for it. They're going to push for a new moment, a new chance to negotiate, to start over again. They said, we're not here to arrest people or to slaughter others, as you're suggesting. We're here to start the process over, to do it right this time, meaning the post-Saleh approach. Now, in the meantime, Ali Abdullah Saleh has returned. He's now, again, the old master, has begun to realize that his most important loyalists have actually joined in with this counter-Hadi movement. And he has no choice, I argue, basically. I mean, people will argue that he's being very clever and he's going to use the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah, to get back into relevance. But basically, he has no choice but to saddle up with the larger popular movement at the time and says, in defiance to the West, look, we need to renegotiate this process, and I want to be a part of this process. And the Americans are actually quite happy with that, because then, he's somebody they actually are familiar with. They have no, he's still their guy in some ways, and they have no influence over this kind of coalition that emerged out of nothing. And unfortunately, I was actually mentioned by the UN representative there. He said, up until the beginning of the bombings, we actually came to an agreement. All we had to do was, sign on a dotted line. Every one of the big players agreed that we're going to start the process over again. We're going to debate and write a new constitution that includes everyone's interest. Now, one final thing, which was kind of the last gesture that basically broke the camel's back. I mean, I should have used a different metaphor. It's unfortunate. I'm sorry. The Middle East reference. A Central Asian camel's back. Let's say that.
Yes.
Okay? Hadi, with the support from the U.S. State Department, the EU, and others, started to push this federation scheme, which is, again, something very popular. And I beseech your audience to think about this for a second and look at the other examples where intervention in conflicts throughout Africa, throughout the Middle East, and including Europe, has been the suggestion is that federalization is the best way forward. And what ostensibly federalization means is the destruction of the Yemeni state. And if you look at the maps, there's a very interesting map of what was actually allocated to what federated unit. All of the oil and gas is to the least populated part of Yemen, which would be this huge swath from central Yemen all the way to the border of Oman, including the Mukalla port and all its infrastructure of liquefied natural gas that had been built with the debt of the 2000s, and all the oil wells that were known. All of that's going to be in the hands of around 1 million people. And of course, they, much like the typical rentier state of the oil-rich Gulf, that's the working model for continued exploitation, right? You pay off with a nice lifestyle for 1 million people, and you just plunder that place left and right. And of course, they get most of the coastline where there's the fisheries, there's the offshore oil. The rest of the country is left with basically nothing. And more importantly, this key area of resistance in the northwest is basically cut off from the coast. That coastal area also very suspiciously connects with exactly the route of that bin Laden group's connecting Saudi Arabia with Djibouti via the bridge. So, everyone's now saying, well, exactly. You're now proposing to divide up Yemen along federated zones, and all the wealth is going to be sequestered off to this huge swath of land with only 1 million people living in it. And the rest of us are going to die in poverty. No way. And again, that was the pretext for basically taking over Sana'a, going all the way down to Aden. And this is one thing that was ripped up. Basically, we're going to rip up this federation proposal, this stupid proposal that the Americans push everywhere in the world. And we're going to start from scratch. And March 2015 comes along. The bombing starts immediately. The rhetoric is already there. It's the recognized government that has the right to be, put back into power. He was elected, right? That even they were still pushing this idea that he was the elected president, representative of Yemen, and the world community recognizes this president. And for whatever reason, he succeeds to actually escape incarceration. He makes it to Saudi Arabia, and he's been ever since propped up as the face of the legitimate regime they want to return to power. In the meantime, they have basically started a campaign of not just a war of disciplining an undisciplined child. The rhetoric, if you listen to the rhetoric, it's very condescending. It just assumes that Yemenis don't have any sovereignty, and they have no agency, and they basically have to behave themselves like the Arabs of the interwar period, right? The mandate period, where they're not civilized yet to run their own country. But more importantly, they're destroying infrastructure. They're going after assets like farms, like milk farms, or dairy farms, ports, bridges, wells. They're dropping cluster bombs on farms so people won't be able to use the farms. They're attacking clusters of populations. They're terrifying people. And, of course, they expected a quick victory. But they couldn't basically see a quick victory. One, because the 18 to 20 million people who are now identified as the problem, right, and who are now under siege. Since March 2015, that port that's there's an attempt to capture the port today, Hodeidah, has been encircled by so-called coalition forces navies. There's no ship that goes in there without being inspected. And yet you'll hear the rhetoric even today that's saying, well, we need to secure the port in order to stop Iran from supplying the Houthis, which is, it just doesn't make any sense. So they're saying we justify blocking ships and inspecting them because we want to make sure that nothing gets through. And they basically said that we've done that successfully. And now they're saying, well, the port has been basically a conduit for Iranian missiles, because that's what the North Yemenis have been able to master. This was, again, a very advanced military under Saleh. They invested heavily in the Republican Guard, most of whom actually joined this popular revolt, this nationalist kind of gesture to win back Yemen from the global forces of capital represented by Saudis and political Islam, etc. Now, the most important thing about this war that is not covered at all, it's for obvious reasons. I mean, one thing we have to recognize is that the media avoids talking about Yemen. They'll do everything it possibly can to avoid actually talking about the humanitarian catastrophe. The UN is so complicit in this process that it's still been using these numbers of civilian deaths of 10,000 or less. I mean, just in April, they issued another report, 9,500 civilian deaths since March 2015. Are you kidding me? And that number has been used since 2016. So it's disgusting, and it's this complicity, and it's this use of certain kinds of tactics. They have dropped this very mysterious kind of bomb, bunker buster bomb. They've been using Yemen always as an experimental ground for new weapons. They've been using this. If you look at the video, they're saying it's neutron, right? It's some kind of nuclear, low-scale nuclear bomb. Again, whenever they can, maximize the human death. It's to terrorize people. There was this notorious event in 2016 where there was a funeral for the former minister of foreign minister. So all the dignitaries of northern Yemen came there, right? And it was supposed to be a moment of mourning. And then it was basically bombs were dropped on the funeral hall. And then 10 minutes later, the Americans had adopted this in Yemen in the 1990s, double tapped it with incendiary bombs, with napalm, basically. So to kill the people who went there to save the injured who are being pulled out of the firing building before. I mean, this is how cynical and sick this so-called coalition is applying its mastery of the air. I mean, there is no air defense. I mean, if Iran was indeed involved in this, they would have given some Stinger missiles and would have changed entirely the dynamics of this war from day one. But the fact is that Iran and China and all the kind of usual
North Korea,
enemies,
and they throw out every enemy of America in the West is involved apparently.
Yeah. And the Yemenis are on their own, and they're dying in large numbers. Cholera outbreaks are the most unprecedented. I mean, they're saying it's the largest outbreaks of cholera in modern history. Over 1 million people. This is in late 2017 were infected. Again, blockades, blocking medicines, and whenever there is a shipment that's pushed into Hodeida by a UN ship, literally in the storage house where all the things are floated, it's bombed and then incinerated. It's the most cynical, criminal kind of campaign against civilians to pressure civilians to basically rise up. And over and over and over again, people go out by the hundreds of thousands to demonstrate on behalf of Palestine every year, Palestine Day, Jerusalem Day, or Quds Day. Every time they go and commemorate the independence of Yemen, it's just a remarkable, horrible, sad story about what has happened in North Yemen, the area that's being basically under siege since 2015. The struggle to keep Aden is shifted from being Ansar Allah, this larger alliance, to now a fight between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. After Trump comes to power, he threatens to change dramatically the entire relationship America has with this war on Yemen in interesting ways. Probably not enough time to talk about it. But one of the results is that Qatar is out. If you recall, that Qatar was the big supporter of the Obamas, of the Clintons. The Clinton Foundation received millions and millions of dollars from Qatar. So for Bannon and those types who were in the first, let's say, 100 days of the Trump administration, they were the enemies. Qatar was the big problem, and probably the Saudis as well. But anyways, you can't bite too many sticks at the same time. And what clearly came out of the break off, where Qatar was basically pushed out of Yemen, its assets like Tawakkol Karman and the Islah Party is basically marginalized now. Al-Qaeda and Daesh forces and other kind of Takfiri groups are very much still active there.
Yep.
But they're fighting on behalf of the Saudi factions. And not only do they end up in the front lines with Ali Muhsin, this general that had been long aligned with Ali Abdullah Saleh, but they're also taking out UAE assets, whether they be the mercenaries that the UAE's hired or directly UAE forces. I mean, UAE is really the only country of the so-called coalition that actually has its own citizens on the ground, and they're dying. And that's an incredibly interesting investment in Yemen that has a lot to say about just how impossible ending this conflict will be if this issue between UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar is not resolved. And it won't be resolved peacefully. It probably won't lead to firing at each other directly, because there are American, British, French bases in all three countries. So basically, that's not going to happen. What will happen is that they're fighting proxy wars. Just like in the old Cold War, now you begin to see a Cold War within the GCC, and Yemen is the direct victim of this. And how it plays itself out depends a lot on the performance of these forces that are proving to be incapable of uprooting and defeating Yemenis. I mean, it's a remarkable resistance of guys who are in flip-flops, who are wearing their skirts, right? And they have Kalashnikovs, and whenever they can kill a couple of Sudanese soldiers, they take their weapons. They've been burning tanks and these armored vehicles left and right. If you go look at the videos, it's a bloodbath right now for the coalition forces along this desert coastline that they were hoping to go incrementally up and conquer this port. And I still think, much like with their fighting over Aden, because Aden is a disaster, there's no services provided, there's lots of assassinations taking place every day. Again, their neighborhoods are split between pro-Saudi and pro-Emirati forces. Much of the same for the rest of South Yemen. UAE is supporting Iraq, the separatist movement again, so they're basically serving as the local forces on the ground on behalf of the UAE. Meantime, parts of the Ali Abdullah Saleh factions that had remained either on the side watching what would happen, now that their leader has been killed after he made this last-minute decision in the end of December of 2017 to switch sides, escape Sana'a, and then somehow join forces and then lead the final victory over the so-called Iranian-backed Houthis. He was caught and killed on the side of the road. And it's largely because he no longer had the support of his forces. His forces have been fighting for 3 years under bombardment every day, been fighting these backed forces of the GCC. They're not going to betray their own people. And so what was once anticipated to be, a possible chip or a chess piece in this larger Yemeni board game is actually proven to be a consolidation of resistance to this coalition. And it means basically now they're trying to figure out, okay, we're going to secure areas where the oil, they're already exporting oil, by the way, from Yemen, lo and behold, right? No central government. Some of the companies are getting their returns on their investments made 10 years ago. Just like Libya, just like Syria, just like Iraq.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the oil is flowing again. Probably they're already digging in some mines. The fishing companies from Spain and from China are just plundering the fish assets of offshore Yemen. The fight over Socotra Island between the UAE and Saudi Arabia has taken some interesting turns. It's now occupied by Saudi forces. They had somehow negotiated without too much firing. Who knows how much blood was spilled elsewhere in Yemen to have that happen. But you begin to see now it play itself out in almost desperate ways. There is almost this desperation. And why? Because in many ways, Saudi Arabia could not wait for a couple more years for Yemen to figure out internally how to adapt to the post-Salah era. Because Saudi Arabia is bankrupt. Basically, it over-leveraged itself. It had basically borrowed huge amounts of money and diverted so much of the income of its oil futures to buying, of course, palaces, but also buying expensive military equipment, which has proven to be worthless in this conflict in Yemen. It's, of course, to pay off empire, right? Globalization of the economy means that the circulation of oil wealth from these small principalities, if you will, has to go back into the global economy in the form of investment in U.S. treasuries, in buying properties, to owning percentages of European companies. So by the time the war starts, Mohammed bin Salman, the chosen son of the current ruler of the Saudi dynasty, has to basically make some moves in order to secure the interest of the family over the long term. And that entails trying to sell a story that Saudi Arabia is reforming, that Saudi Arabia is on the move upwards. It's more or less modeling itself to UAE. It's going to basically be the next UAE. Come and invest in Saudi Arabia. Come bring your billions of dollars where you're now investing in Dubai, or you're investing in China, or you're investing somewhere else in Bitcoin. Come and invest in Saudi Arabia. The problem is that everybody who reads Financial Times, even, let alone who actually has the money to look into the details of the economy of Saudi Arabia, one, it knows that they don't produce the oil that they actually sell. They buy a lot of the oil offshore and then resell it as Aramco oil. A lot of their wells have dried up. They know very well why they've been salivating over the idea of going into Yemen, because of Yemen's oil resources. The problem is the UAE is blocking that, right? The problem is that you have Yemenis saying, no, you're not going to take over our territories. So how are they going to finance this empire, this kind of regime anymore? They basically have not been paying bills for years now. The Bin Laden Group has been possessed by the Saudi government. Bin Laden Group doesn't exist anymore because they didn't pay bills to Bin Laden Group for years. All the hospital, they've been following the news, they've been throwing out people left and right. They've been basically saying, we want to give jobs to Saudis. Give me a break. You haven't been paying your Filipino workers for the last year. You've thrown them out. And so no one's going to invest in Saudi Arabia. The last numbers that came from Financial Times was that every month it drops. It's now at its all-time low of foreign direct investment in Saudi Arabia. It's around $1 billion, which is pathetic. And it's most likely coming from Saudi companies that are repatriating money that Mohammed bin Salman is trying to do, right? We know that by his arresting his cousins and torturing some people to open up their bank accounts so they can get some of this huge amounts of savings from these rich Saudi families. All this has come to naught because every day they're spending $300 million on this war in Yemen. And, to pay for the mercenaries, the Americans and the British and the Australians who are running the air campaign, right? There's no such thing as a Saudi Air Force. It's run by the Americans and British and the Swedish companies as well. And they're not going to take a check from Saudi Arabia, right? They're not stupid. They're taking cash. They're taking, and basically Saudi Arabia every month, they can only borrow short term now, by the way. And it's 8%, 9%, 10%. If interest rates go up, if T-bills go to 2%, 3%, Saudi is messed up. It's finished. They can't borrow. They're borrowing money just to pay the bills from last month. And again, $300 million a day at least, let alone the political amounts of buying out political rivals in Saudi Arabia. And in the meantime, unfortunately for the UAE, they're stuck in the same situation in many ways. They've kind of now in this war of attrition against not only Yemenis, but Saudi Arabia. Who's going to survive? And it plays itself out so interesting in the media. If anybody, even in the English language media, sponsored by these different governments, because the UAE despises political Islam. They're the most terrified from Salafism and from the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the most criminalized groups in the UAE. And yet here they are supposedly in partnership with Saudi Arabia. No, it's actually much more nuanced. You have to look at the media, read between the lines of things like Middle East Eye and these other kinds of, and Al Jazeera English. I mean, that's Qatar. But then you have the Saudi outlets, which have in it's no longer subtle, very hostile terms, talking about UAE as, this criminal organization that's in cahoots with Israel and it's working behind the back of the Houthi government. It's if it wasn't so tragic and disgusting and criminal, it would be fascinating stuff for a political scientist. But we're not allowed to talk about this, right? We don't talk about this because this war is basically a war which no one can mention, because politically it's interesting that it's not permitted to actually circulate the conversations of everyday politics in regards to foreign policy.
I say that, I say that every day. Yes. That it's constantly happening, and yet nobody wants to talk about it. Isa, we are just at the end. I think we've got about a minute left. Once again, I want to thank you, and we'll have to get you back on because I've already got a million other questions that we could get into, specifically the media coverage of this through Arab media and things like that. But a minute left. Isa, tell everybody where they can go to follow your work, where they can go to get a copy of your new book, Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World.
If there are any retail bookshops left in your part of the world, I would encourage you to go to the bookshop, meet some of the people who are working behind the counter, ask someone could you please order the book? Because I'm pretty sure that it's not on the bookshelf, but that's also quite interesting, the lack of attention that such a book gets from even Yemeni experts. But anyway, that's another thing. Go to your bookshop. I would encourage you to encourage the local public library to get a copy, so the largest number of people can actually have access to it. But then, go to the publisher's website and order it from them, or find a used copy somewhere, which you can find from the various providers. And then my work you can find going to Google Scholar. You can go to academia.edu, and I've uploaded a lot of my earlier stuff. And I have quite a few interviews and lectures that are on YouTube, which you can actually follow, and it more or less says many of the same things in different ways. And you get to see what I look like, and you can see I'm actually very animated and angry, and I am angry. And And we all should be very angry. We all should be very angry. And it says a lot about the larger world. This is not just some isolated case where we can ignore. This is saying so much about our world. And believe me, people in North America, it's coming to you guys next if it hasn't already come. And what's happened to befallen Yemen or Congo or elsewhere, it's coming to you guys. And really, stop taking those opiates. Wake. I mean, your audience almost like is already attuned to all this, of course, Piers. But encourage others just to think for a second about what is happening to Yemen, and show some empathy, but also start talking about it in terms of what's happening in our own societies.
No rules, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, We are American Freedom Radio.
Since the beginning, civilizations have risen and fallen. Rome, ancient Persia, Mongolia, Britain, and now America. Befallen by natural disasters, broken families, moral decay, lack of preparedness and conflict. Don't let this happen to you. Are you prepared? Would you like to help others prepare? AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com is looking for distributors. Email bugoutamerica@usa.com. Go to AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, a veteran-owned and operated company. But do it today.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me in American Freedom Radio. Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology, they have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
And when we're not invading some sovereign nation or setting it on fire from the air, which is more fun for our Nintendo pilots, then we're usually declaring war on something here at home. Did you ever notice that about us? We love to declare war on things here in America. Anything we don't like about ourselves, we declare war on it. We don't do anything about it. We just declare war on it. It's the only metaphor we have in our public discourse for solving problems, declaring war. We have to declare war on everything. We have a war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on litter, the war on cancer, the war on drugs. But you ever notice we got no war on homelessness? Huh? No war on homelessness. You know why? There's no money in that problem. No money to be made off of the homeless. If you could find a solution to homelessness where the corporate swine and the politicians could steal $2 million each, you'd see the streets of America begin to clear up pretty quick. I'll guarantee you that. I will guarantee you that.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs, and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control is good. 5, roger, copy. 3, 2, 1. Okay.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio.